There is new life in my front yard. Have you seen it? Yes, the orange and yellow and red flowers. The buds on the citrus trees. Yes, to the blooming succulents. Yes, to new sprouts in the garden. But I'm talking about a specific new life, coming from the strawberry shrubs that my housemate has planted in an old bamboo gutter. Those little hardy plants, I had really doubted whether they'd survive our darker, colder, wetter months. Many of those leaves had turned brown, or at least dark and grayish green. So each morning for most of March, I had skeptically approached these strawberry shrubs, puzzled if they would actually ever return to life. And now, I can gloriously exclaim that I see that telltale, young, bright, light green hue, the same hue you've probably been seeing on the sides of the canyon walls, amidst those browner, grayed strawberry leaves. It's new life. A reminder, I suppose, that new life emerges from the husk, from the remnant. It's a reminder of the cycles of things, that out of the dormancy and decay and death, there's also the advent of life stirring anew. If you've been taking in the pictures that we've had to accompany our worship today, you'll probably see a play on a similar theme. A sprout popping up from the burnt forest floor. Succulent buds popping up amid rubble. New coral growing atop bleached coral. Plants or fungi growing on a decayed log. Nature is showing us that new life is not in any real way new. It's simply the most recent, the thing that grows from what has come before. Now, the stories of our own lives and the lives of our communities do not always seem to mirror these cycles of nature. We live sometimes instead on a timeline. The past is in the past, and the future is in the future. And if we can only manage to stay in the present, mindful of the now, we'll stave off all those fears and regrets. There's this philosopher I used to love to read, a Jewish German philosopher named Walter Benjamin. And he was this tragic and lyrical writer. And one time, he described the march of history like this. It's as if we're watching the wreckage of history piling up before us. And we'd like to go back and fix what has been broken. We'd like to go back and make meaning out of every little thing that has transpired. But instead, we keep being blown by a storm into the future. We can only watch the rubble pile up higher. When I think of life as just a unidirectional line pushing ever forward, it can make meaning-making very hard for me. We only have a chance to tell certain stories about certain aspects of the past. We can't cover everything, right? And as Kia's reflection attuned us to, it matters who tells those stories and what stories are lifted up. But I'm also heartened to think that our ability to tell stories, to tell histories, to pass on knowledge and know-how between generations means that we have some chance to return to that rubble of the past, to lift up new stories that were always already there. Stories that were always already there. Now, by the end of summer 2017, I started telling a new story about myself. I came out to myself. The summer had been a trying one. I was doing a lot of deep self-reflection while also serving in the role of a chaplain. It seemed as all of my stuff was stirred up and very present with me in the day-to-day. That can be a powerful time to tell new stories. Throughout my life, I've had this rather I'd had this rather unexplored sense that something about my gender and my sexual orientation was different than the norm. But because a lot of my romantic partners were women, and because I didn't get bullied for being very effeminate, I felt like I didn't deserve to claim a label like bi or trans. Like it would be a disservice to people who were more impacted by the ways that this world is oftentimes unfriendly and hurtful and unwelcoming to LGBTQ people, for me to identify as something other than straight or cisgendered. Well, that summer, I came to understand that thinking of myself as just straight or cisgendered was doing more harm to me than it was serving the movement. I didn't want the world to see me like that anymore. Not for any ill will, but it just didn't feel right for me. So that summer I started to identify as queer, both in my sexuality and in my gender. For older generations, that word queer can be pretty loaded, right? Because it was often used as a slur. Nowadays, the word has been reclaimed by LGBTQ folks to describe certain ways of being and orientations towards the world and certain cultures within our communities. It's not some monolithic way of being, but it's rather a way of holding the multitudes, different ways of relating to your gender or your sexuality that are outside of the norm. Specifically for me, this has meant spending time questioning and exploring how I express my gender in the world. It doesn't fit into a neat binary of all the way male or all the way female. It's sort of a combination of those, or it's outside the traditional binary. So that label queer, it leaves the space to explore for me. But here's why I tell this story. It changed how I related to my former self. I started looking at all these moments in the past moments from my life, and I retold my own story anew. I started to remember and highlight and lift up those times when I explored dressing more effeminately throughout my life, putting on dresses with friends or little berets in my hair. I started to remember those confusing moments when I didn't really feel like I belonged in straight male culture, and it felt kind of weird. Like there was a club I was supposed to buy into, but the type of intimacy it created wasn't really available to me. I started to remember all the different romantic attractions I had experienced throughout my life, and the gay men I had looked up to and admired throughout my life. It's not that I had forgotten any of those moments, but they just didn't fit into my old story that I was telling myself when I was identifying as a cisgender person or as a straight person. But suddenly, they could fit into my new story, and it just felt so much more right, just more freeing and good. And it's allowed me to feel more authentic in my leadership and comfortable in many of my relationships. I recognize, however, how sometimes letting go of an old story can be more of a painful process. Sometimes we lose someone who's close to us, who really defined the story of who we are. How are we supposed to go on when we lose them? On what grounds are we going to tell a new story? And sometimes we live haunted by the painful memories of the past, the hurt we cannot turn away from. I'm thinking about Iggy Peck's second grade teacher and the way so much of her life was impacted by the story of what happened to her in that elevator. And sometimes letting go of an old story can mean opening up a lot more uncertainty and feeling a lot more unmoored. I've been studying this psychological researcher, Dr. Daryl Wynn Sue, who talks a lot about how people talk about race. And Sue basically says that when multiracial groups get together to talk about race, there's at least two different stories being told. There's what Sue calls the master narrative, the way that the dominant group sort of views itself and understands itself. And then there's what Sue sees as the counter-narrative, where people who are not in the dominant group sometimes tell the truth of the reality of the situation. So sometimes in our country, we have this idea that we live in a complete meritocracy, where if you just work really hard, the best will get the nicest things. But the reality is more complicated than that and carries with it the history of inequality and inequity that lives in our country. So that dialogue between the master narrative and the counter narrative is sort of what is being negotiated when people talk about race together. We in this congregation had a little bit of that counter narrative this past December, if you remember. We were led in a series of conversations that sort of culminated in this timeline that is still at the back of our meeting house, that tells the story of the times within our congregation when instances of racism happened, and then what sort of the congregational response was. And the purpose of that exercise was to sort of say, we've been working on this for a really long time. Why is it still hurting people? Why is it still hard for us to do inclusion in the right way? And so the unearthing of some of the truths might make it possible for us to all tell a new story together. And I want to acknowledge that there's a deep courage to the type of truth-telling that took place in telling a new story. But I also want to acknowledge that there's a real grief and uncertainty that is opened up when any of our old stories are troubled or are sort of falling out of use. I really do believe that our old stories, we need to take the time to grieve them. Whether it's the old story of who you were in a relationship with someone else, or who your community is. And when I say we need to grieve them, we need to give them the time and the space and the attention in our hearts that they need so that we can be settled and be open to the possibility of new stories. I think there's a lot of hope here, hope in the new stories. Just as new life grows from what has come before it, so too do new stories, they get their nutrients. They get their meaning out of the old stories that have already been told. It's not like we're casting away and creating a new story from whole cloth. We're building on what's come before, and we're working together. Perhaps you might tell the new story of when you've lost someone, how to integrate their memory into your new version of who you're going to be going forward. I thought about it a lot this weekend, where a number of lay leaders within this congregation began the first of what will be many sessions of the Beloved Conversations, which is a series of conversations in small groups about race, where we're going to work on having brave conversation and dialogue so we can address some of those issues head on. And we were together in that room, and I want to share what happened in that room just briefly to say there was a lot of love in that room. There was a lot of caring for one another. There was a lot of attention. There was a lot of bravery. And I heard new truths, new assumptions sort of get lifted up to the surface in a way that gave me a lot of hope for what was going to come in the future. We're all on the cusp of writing our new stories. And in so doing, we're not just opening ourselves up to the possibility, but we're also taking on the responsibility that each of us in this room, in the lives that we lead, and the community we build here, and the work we do in the wider world, all of that is going to require us to take in hand the telling of a new story. And we can support one another in doing that. And as we bear this new responsibility to new stories, attentively, we honor and draw what has come before so that we may grow and have life anew. May it be so. Blessed be. Amen.